Federalism in the United States has evolved into a complex power-sharing arrangement between the states and the federal government. Both levels of government are pretty actively involved in most policy issues, and they have to cooperate to a large extent in order to deliver programs to serve the American people. Whether we're talking about healthcare, or education, or transportation, or housing, or any number of other vitally important policy areas, major government programs tend to involve a blending of state and federal professional and monetary resources. But these shared responsibilities do not always go smoothly, and serious conflicts can arise over how much decision-making power each level of government should have. This tendency is exemplified really well in the case of environmental policy, where California has at times been a critical driving force for the development of national environmental programs, but where conflict between the state of California and the federal government has sometimes been intense. One starting point for understanding the important role of a state like California within the federal system is to consider a passage from a Supreme Court opinion in the early 1930s. Writing to argue why the court should not strike down a particular business regulation created by the state of Oklahoma, Justice Louis Brandeis wrote, "It is one of the happy incidents of the federal system that a single courageous state may, if its citizens choose, serve as a laboratory and try novel social and economic experiments without risk to the rest of the country." This passage is frequently quoted as one of the clearest statements of the advantages of federalism in modern times, that new policy ideas can be tried out on a smaller scale within a state to see if they're worth spreading to other states or even the nation as a whole. And no state has embodied this ideal of a laboratory of democracy more than the state of California, especially when it comes to developing new approaches to deal with environmental problems. California has always acted as an early adopter of new policy ideas. Political science has a term, policy diffusion, that expresses the ways in which government policy choices are influenced by the choices of other governments. Policies have a way of spreading from one government jurisdiction to another, and when political scientists examine which states adopted new policies more often and more quickly, not only did California rank highest of all 50 states, it was in a category all by itself. You could go back to the early days of the progressive movement, when California was the second state to adopt a workers' compensation program for employees who were injured on the job, or when it became only the sixth state in the Union to grant women the right to vote. Or you could look at the 1990s, when it became the first state to legalize medical marijuana, and the second state to adopt a three-strikes criminal sentencing law. Or you could look at just the past few years, in which California became the first state to adopt a ban on single-use plastic bags at large retail establishments, and the first state to offer Medicaid benefits to young adult undocumented immigrants. I just want to emphasize before I get into the specifics of California's environmental policy that the state's policy innovation extends through a wide range of different policy areas. California has been an innovator on all sorts of environmental issues, including open space protection, water conservation, management of coastal zones, and solid waste management. But for this video, I'm going to focus in on the environmental issues of energy and air quality policy. These issues are of particular importance in relation to federalism because the programs developed by California to clear the air and provide sufficient energy resources to the state's residents and businesses have become foundational elements of efforts to address global climate change in other states. And California has become a major player within the federal system, pushing the national government to adopt more aggressive policies in this area. So the story begins with a law passed by the California State Legislature in 1967. The Mulford-Carroll Act created the California Air Resources Board, now commonly referred to as CARB. California cities, especially Los Angeles, had been dealing with horrendous smog in the decades following the post-World War II boom that happened in California. Early efforts to deal with the problem at the local level had mixed results. but helped to spur on the state to come up with a more vigorous response. In creating CARB, the state created what was at that time the most powerful environmental government agency in the country. It was given the authority to regulate motor vehicles and businesses that emitted pollutants into the air. It had a substantial budget that allowed it to hire scientists and other experts to study the causes and health effects of air pollution and examine the feasibility of greener technologies that could be adopted to improve air quality. The work done by CARB helped to lay the foundation for the first serious piece of national legislation to address air pollution, which was the 1970 Clean Air Act. So as air pollution moved onto the national agenda, California politicians made sure that their early innovations in this area would not be overridden by nationwide standards. They succeeded in having a section included in the National Clean Air Act that gave California the right to apply for a waiver to be able to implement stricter air pollution standards than the national standards, if these stricter standards were necessary to address what was called California's compelling and extraordinary conditions. These waivers, known as Section 209 waivers, grew in importance when later amendments to the Clean Air Act allowed other states to choose whether they wanted to follow the national standards or adopt California's stricter regulations. This became particularly important in 2002 when California passed a law, Assembly Bill 1493, directing CARB to develop regulations on automobile greenhouse gas emissions, the first such regulations in the world. Basically, this was an attempt by California to spur the auto industry into getting serious about developing hybrid and electric cars. At the time, the Bush administration was avoiding taking any action at the national level to address global climate change, and for the first time ever tried to deny California's Section 209 waiver. In other words, denying California's right to develop greenhouse gas standards for cars. This resulted in a lengthy court battle that was ultimately resolved when President Obama took office and reversed the Bush administration's stance on this issue. At this time, with car companies on the verge of bankruptcy due to the Great Recession and appealing to the federal government for a bailout, the Obama administration's EPA, or Environmental Protection Agency, coordinated with the state of California to harmonize new, much more aggressive automobile standards that ratchet up the fuel efficiency of new vehicles sold each year through the year 2025. The Trump administration has acted, just as George W. Bush had done, to revoke California's waiver so the national government can undo the Obama administration's standards and implement less stringent regulations nationwide. In the area of energy, California has also been a leader. In 1974, the state created the California Energy Commission and gave it broad powers to plan for the state's energy needs. At this time, the major energy utilities in the state, companies like PG&E, were projecting that the demand for energy would grow so rapidly that it would be necessary to build between 80 and 120 nuclear power plants in the state by the year 2000. Fortunately, the California Energy Commission had other ideas and made California the first state to make energy conservation a major part of its long-range energy planning. This included things like developing the country's first energy efficiency standards for appliances, something that the national government would later adopt. California also became one of the first states to decouple utility profits from energy sales. In other words, up to that time, for energy companies like PG&E, the more power they sold, the more profit they made. Decoupling changed the formula to remove the incentive for energy utilities to simply sell more energy. In 1982, California became one of the first governments in the world to offer credits for wind power, resulting in California having 87% of the world's wind power capacity by the mid-1980s. Although this credit was later taken away, and California fell behind in wind power development, the state's efforts in the early 80s were important in getting this fledgling renewable energy industry off the ground. And in 2002, California became an early adopter of a renewable portfolio standard, basically a requirement that a certain share of the state's energy come from renewable sources by a certain date. This has become probably the most important policy tool at the state level to drive reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, as 29 states now have these policies in place. Since 2002, California has ratcheted up its standard a few times, and in 2018 adopted a standard requiring 100% renewable energy by the year 2045, becoming the second state after Hawaii to adopt a 100% renewable standard. These are just a few highlights of the leadership role California has taken in the areas of air quality and energy policy. But hopefully they've been enough to give you a sense of the important role that the state has played in addressing these issues, not just within California, but also in shaping policy that extends to other states and to the country as a whole. People who are concerned about climate change rightly express a lot of frustration at the lack of a comprehensive policy to address the problem at the national level. But California's efforts, beginning with the efforts to deal with smog in the 1960s and energy demand in the 70s, laid the foundation for what would ultimately become quite vigorous efforts to tackle global climate change. Without these efforts, our appliances would be less energy efficient, our cars would be less fuel efficient, and we'd be further behind in the development of electric vehicles, and the development of wind and solar industries would be lagging behind where they are today. By acting as a laboratory of democracy, California spurred new approaches in these areas that have spread well beyond the borders of the state.